This is the start of page 4 on globalization. All right, key turning point battles to know for the Civil War. Antietam is really considered the turning point, even though the North goes on to lose still after that. Right, that was in 1862, Antietam. And why is Antietam considered the turning point battle?
Because it gave Lincoln the support he needed to get the Emancipation Proclamation.
Very good. Yes, it led to the Emancipation Proclamation, which committed the government to ending slavery, even though it didn't free a single slave, because it did not apply to the border states, and the Confederate states were not paying attention to what our government said anyways. Therefore, it keeps the Confederates from getting aid from Britain, because the public puts pressure on Britain not to aid the South, since this is a war to end slavery now, because Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, had been published over there, so there was a lot of public pressure in Britain not to help the South. Other turning points, I would put Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July of 1863, because just that Battle of Gettysburg, I mean, that definitely halted the Confederate Army from being able to accomplish anything, and Vicksburg got us control of the Mississippi River.
Would you also consider the Battle of Bull Run?
No, not really. I mean, that made us ultimately realize this was going to be a longer war than what we thought, but it wasn't really a turning point. Okay. As far as the British go, their influence in that war, again, cotton diplomacy, that's the term given to the fact that the South thought Britain would give them aid because they were dependent upon cotton from the South. So that's what cotton diplomacy means. They thought the dependence of Britain on them for cotton would make them aid the South. And they do to some extent. But again, that is kind of halted after the Emancipation Proclamation. The Trent Affair is when a Union ship was stopped by a British ship, or a Union ship stopped a British ship that had Confederate diplomats on it, and we took the diplomats and held them, and that made Britain really mad, so we ended up releasing them, because the last thing we wanted to do was make Britain mad and make them side with the South. And British did sell the South warships. That's what the Confederate raiders were. Old ships from Britain that they sold to the South. That's what Confederate raiders were. But they did not give all the economic aid or the official recognition that the South had hoped. All right, results of the Civil War then. You do have the end of slavery. That comes with the Emancipation Proclamation commits us to ending slavery, and it frees the slaves, but it doesn't really free anybody. And then the 13th Amendment formally frees the slaves and ends slavery. And that's going to be followed by the 14th Amendment, making them citizens, the 15th Amendment, giving African American men the right to vote. For a while, the North and the Republicans are going to dominate government, especially because under the Reconstruction Act, the federal government actually went down and occupied the South with military. It also led to industrialization because people made a lot of money off of producing things for the war in the North. Those people then are going to have the capital coming out of the war to start these big industries that help to industrialize us. And we start building the Transcontinental Railroad under the Pacific Railway Act during the Civil War. We authorize it. And the Transcontinental Railroad is one of the main things that industrialized us. You also see a rebirth of the women's movement. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to restart their efforts. Abolition had kind of taken a front seat to what was going on with the reform movements. And now after the 15th Amendment is ratified, the women are going to say, we were ignored again. And you're also going to see temperance pick back up. And women are a big part of that.
So was the 15th Amendment the one that gave black males the right?
Yeah.
What was the 14th? What did that one?
Made them citizens. All right, so then that sends us into the imperial era. Industrialization is one of the causes of imperialism. So when we talk about imperialism, we're really talking about 1890, I would say, through 1914. Okay. And some of the causes. There were economic causes. We had industrialized. We were making more than what we could buy. So we needed new markets for our manufactured goods. So that's one of the reasons we begin to look elsewhere for other places to sell our goods. After the Civil War, we also officially closed the frontier, meaning that we settle the entire country. So that scares people. After Turner's Frontier Thesis is released and says, so much of the frontier has helped develop American character. And, part of the reason why there isn't like class warfare is that there was always a frontier where you could start from scratch and make something of yourself. So what's going to happen to America and our character? And is there going to be class warfare now that there's no more frontier? So we're looking for a new frontier. We really need to do this to compete with the rest of the world. We were late in the game kind of when it comes to imperialism. So if we want to be a world power, we need to exert our influence in other parts of the world. Okay, social Darwinism. That idea that some people are just made of a finer clay and that's why they're successful, and then other people are just not made of that finer clay and that's why they fail. But that idea kind of starts this whole idea that it's the white man's burden. It's our duty to go civilize these other poorer regions, teach them our religion, teach them our government, teach them our ways. So there was like a moral responsibility people felt. We needed to establish a stronger navy if we wanted to compete with the rest of the world. And if we're going to have a navy, we're going to have naval bases across the world. Same thing. We're going to need to have, if we're going to trade with people in China, we're going to have bases where those trade ships can stop and refuel. And then jingoism. That term refers to extreme nationalism. And they're very pro-war as being a way to show our nationalism and expand. So some examples of how we become imperial during this era. People really consider the Spanish-American War the start of our imperial era. So that's in 1798. It was May through August, 1798. 1898, sorry. Wrong century.
I totally just went.
Sorry. Okay. What are some causes of the Spanish-American War? Causes of the Spanish-American War. What do you guys remember? I was not here when you learned all this, so I'm interested to see what you can recall here. Kyle?
You had, what's his name, Pancho Villa?
That was a Mexico situation. Separate.
We had the Spanish.
Amelia?
Over the Philippines?
Yep, that's one. It was fought in Cuba and it's fought in the Philippines. It was a two-front war. Who did we fight? Spain, okay. All right, now, why did we get in this war with Spain all of a sudden? Dylan?
There was that one letter, we intercepted a letter from diplomat.
Okay. All right, yeah, let's back up. Okay, we need to work on this a little bit. Okay, so the Cubans were revolting against the Spanish. And our yellow journalism was reporting on this revolt. Yellow journalism is another cause. And they were kind of exaggerating what was going on down in Cuba, although there were horrific concentration camps set up and things like that. So this was published heavily in our yellow press, and we started to sympathize with these Cuban rebels. You also had American businessmen who owned plantations down in Cuba, and they were economically being hurt with this revolt. So we go to war to help the Cuban people revolt against Spain for economic reasons, because also we just sympathize with them, fighting an imperial power for their freedom. And there were some things that helped instigate that, not just the revolution. The Delome letter, where you had a Spanish diplomat insulting President McKinley. And that gets published in the yellow press and blown out of proportion, and America's in an uproar. You had the sinking of the USS Maine, which was docked in the harbor at Cuba. The yellow press immediately reports Spain blew it up. It turns out years later we find out it's probably a fire in the coal bin. Spain didn't do it at all. But they jumped to those conclusions. And then you had jingoism. You had people like Theodore Roosevelt who had never fought in a war before. They felt like it was a way to restore America's masculinity. Okay? This was an opportunity for us to assert our power in the world and gain territory. Not just gain possible influence in Cuba, but gain Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, which could be key ports and stopovers for us. So it was a very short war, settled with the Treaty of Paris of 1898. We got Guam and Puerto Rico, and then we paid an additional $12 million for the Philippines. Now here's the thing, in both the Philippines and Cuba. In Cuba, we actually passed something called the Teller Amendment, saying that we would not take over Cuba after the war. Okay. So we don't directly take over Cuba. But we make them sign the Platt Amendment, which basically said we're not going to withdraw our troops from Cuba unless you do certain things, like give us a naval base here, agree to let us intervene in your affairs at any time, stuff like that. So we indirectly were controlling Cuba under the Platt Amendment till 1933. Now the Philippines, verbally, the naval commander in the Philippines told Aguinaldo, who was leading the revolution in the Philippines, hey, we're going to give you your freedom after we help you win it. And instead, we took the Philippines. We paid Spain $12 million, and we made it American territory. And that led to a war between us and the Philippines for 3 years. Okay? In which we did some horrible, I think I had you do a reading that talked about some of the horrible things we did to the Filipino people during that war. So another effect of this is it leads to the insular cases. INSULAR. And these were a series of Supreme Court cases that asked the question, do our rights follow the flag? Do people in U.S. territories automatically get the rights of U.S. citizenship? And the answer is no. Congress gets to decide. So this really sparked a debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists in our country over, should we be imperializing? If we do, what kind of rights do those people have?
So the territories didn't have the same rights?
No, not necessarily. Congress would decide. That said that we would not take over Cuba if we helped them win the war against Spain. All right, we have just a little bit left to do. Last page. Stay with me. It won't take us more than 5 minutes. Other examples of our imperialism in this era. And I would be able to make sure you can link the causes of imperialism to some examples. So give an example of a place we got for a naval base. Give an example of a place we got because we wanted to civilize them. The Philippines would be a good example. All right, annexation of Hawaii. The American colonists in Hawaii overthrew the Hawaiian queen, Liliuokalani, or Queen Lil, because they didn't want to get taxed on imports to the U.S. They were importing all kinds of fruits to the United States, and they were having to pay a tariff. And if they became a U.S. territory, they wouldn't have to pay that tax. You had the open door policy in China. Remember, basically, we were late in the game in China. But we needed China as a market for our goods, for our manufactured goods. I remember all the European countries had already kind of divvied it up into spheres of influence, and we didn't have one. So what we did is we came in and said, China should be open to trade with everyone. There shouldn't be spheres of influence. And that was our way in. And then under Roosevelt, you had the Panama Canal. It was to our benefit to build a canal that would make it faster to go from the Atlantic and to the Pacific. That was essential for us to trade. It was essential for us to build up a navy. Panama or Colombia had control of Panama. Colombia wouldn't let us build the canal, so what did we do? We caused Panama to revolt against Colombia, and we supported that revolt. And then Panama gave us the rights to build the canal. So we encouraged a revolt of Panama against Colombia, and then Panama let us build the canal. Okay, for the imperialists versus anti-imperialists, we kind of already went over the viewpoint of the imperialists, because the causes of imperialism would be their reasons for imperialism. So I would just say C, causes of imperialism on the imperialist side. What were some of the arguments of the anti-imperialists for why we should not be expanding, we should not be taking these territories?
Not exactly sure what this means, but despotism, thank you, a broad despotism.
Exactly. If we rule these territories like a dictator or a monarch would, and we limit people's freedoms, is that going to come back to home eventually, that our freedoms will be limited at home? Plus, people felt like it was just immoral, that we're a country founded upon democracy, and then we're going into places like the Philippines and not letting them have their own self-government. Amelia?
They also didn't want to get into Far Eastern politics.
Very good. Yeah. Is this going to drag us into foreign conflict and foreign war? People like Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor, why was he an anti-imperialist?
Because he wanted the labor to stay in the U.S.
He thought acquiring these territories could make business go elsewhere and ultimately hurt the American laborer. You also had people who were just racist. They didn't want people of a different race having American citizenship. So that was part of it too. Also the cost. What's the cost going to be to our country to maintain this empire? Okay, last thing we need to go through quickly is the presidents of the imperial era. So you had Roosevelt from 1901 to 1908, and we refer to his diplomacy as big stick diplomacy. What that means essentially is he's going to use force to get what he wants. So the Great White Fleet, the Navy kind of is what his big stick was. He's going around showing that to people to show our might. The Roosevelt Corollary, that was an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine. Not only do these other countries not have the right to intervene in the affairs of our hemisphere, but if a country is having a conflict with a European country, like a Latin American country is having a conflict with a European country, we have the right to intervene in that country's affairs. So an example would be like Santo Domingo or Venezuela. Both of those countries were in debt to European nations. European nations were threatening to come over here and occupy those countries till the debt was repaid. And in both cases, we stepped in, we oversaw the repayment of the debt to keep Europe out. Santo Domingo and Venezuela. All right, Taft then from 1909 to 1912. He had dollar diplomacy, which basically said we're going to spread our influence not with force. Okay, another example for Roosevelt would be like the Panama Canal, how we got it. That would be an example of big stick diplomacy. So Taft doesn't want to use force. He wants to use money and economic investment. He wants American business to invest in countries so that we have more influence there. So an example would be getting American business to fund railroad projects in China so that we get more influence in China. And once we build those railroads, our manufactured goods can go even further into China. And then you had Wilson with the so-called moral diplomacy, that we need to right past wrongs, and he's all about expanding democracy. And really World War I is an example of that. I mean, he fought that war as a war to expand and save democracy. But other examples would be the Jones Act. He had Congress pass the Jones Act in 1917, which eventually promised the Philippines independence. And he intervened in Mexico when a dictator named Huerta came to power. Okay. Now, freeze.